Hello, Dr. James Bogash, expert in health and longevity and creator of Bogash Life and Balance. And today we're going to talk about what's really been a pretty hot topic over the past 2.5 years or so, and that has to do with heart inflammation. So pericarditis or myocarditis, either caused by COVID infection or caused by vaccination. And those are important to look at the differences between the two because it's pretty well accepted now that the vaccination does produce heart inflammation in susceptible people. Typically, teenage boys are the most likely to be affected. So if the vaccination creates a risk of heart inflammation, how does that compare to heart inflammation from getting COVID? Because then the argument is, well, it's still safer to get the vaccination. So two studies we're going to compare here. The first one was done out of Israel, huge study. They looked at almost 197,000 adults that were post-COVID from this March 20, so at the beginning of all this, when we had the ancestral strain and alpha and delta, whatever, but the early stages when it was known to generally create more problems, all the way up through January of 21. So pretty long study, huge numbers of people, 197,000. They then compared these to 591,000 people, almost 591,000 people who did not have COVID, because we get heart inflammation even when we don't have COVID-19. Like, it's just, so you have to compare the rates of something to see if there's a difference. And so when we're in the middle of something, a lot of times we let emotions cloud our judgment instead of waiting and stepping back to see where we're at. Sometimes when we're in the middle of things, like we panic or we want to try to do something for a perceived threat. It turns out that when they looked at this very large group of adults, there were 9 cases of myocarditis and 11 cases of pericarditis. This was about exactly matched as what happened to the people who did not have COVID. So in other words, the study out of Israel, looking at a very large number of people, there was no increased risk of myocarditis or pericarditis with people who had COVID-19. It's very important to know, and it's also not something we've heard in the past year or so. There was all this fear that this was happening, and yet when we look at the data, when we kind of calm down and look at it, we didn't see an increased risk in people who had COVID over everything else that people get. So then we need to look at this recent review of the phase 3 trial in both COVID and Moderna, the vaccine trials, to look at the risk of myocarditis, because I've already mentioned that it's an accepted risk now. Just established that, according to the Israeli study, there is no increased risk of myocarditis or heart inflammation from COVID, which means any increased risk from the vaccine is an increased risk and not balanced out by lowering the risk of heart inflammation from getting COVID. So what they found was that when they compared the cases over placebo, so again, remember there's a baseline of people in society that get heart inflammation. They found that in Pfizer there was an increased risk of 10.1 people developing myopericarditis out of 10,000 people. Moderna, the trial was a little bit higher, 15.1 out of 10,000. These numbers are still not large, but they're 10 times, 15 times what we get with COVID infection, according to the Israeli study. Not something that we've heard in the past year, 2 years. There's been a lot of fear, and that fear was based on data we did not have. So again, I'll post a link to these particular studies in the description. It's just, I think we're going to look back on a lot of things that we did and realize that we panicked an awful lot about things that arguably we probably had little control over. We wanted to think that we had control over them, but in the grand scheme of things, Mother Nature wins, and the The only thing we had control of was the health choices that we made to keep ourselves healthier or not healthier. So as always, I'll post a link to these 2 particular studies in the description. Make sure you like this video, share it with somebody who you think needs the information, and subscribe to the channel.